So here's the deal. Recently, Graveyard Keeper was being given away for free on Steam, and that's not random. With a sequel reportedly on the way in 2026, this felt like one of those moments where the developers are trying to get more people into the franchise before the next big release drops. And I thought to myself, alright, perfect timing. I grabbed the game, picked up all the DLCs as well, because from what I've seen that's apparently the best way to experience it, and decided to give it a proper shot. No surface level impressions, no quick takes. I wanted to really dig into it and see whether this is actually a hidden gem people have been sleeping on, or one of those games that sounds great on paper but falls apart once you start playing. More importantly, what can you expect from the second game based on the first one? So let's dig deep. What really hooked me right from the start is just how different this game feels compared to anything else in the genre. Instead of planting crops and building a wholesome little farm like in Stardew Valley, Graveyard Keeper throws you into a world where you're managing corpses, performing autopsies, and, let's be honest, doing some pretty questionable things to turn a profit. And that's exactly the appeal. The game leans hard into this pitch-black humor, constantly balancing between being disturbing and genuinely funny, which gives it a tone that's both memorable and kinda addictive. I like that it doesn't try to play it safe. It embraces the absurdity of its premise and builds its entire identity around it. Because of that, it doesn't just feel like another farming sim with a reskin. It feels like something with real personality, something bold enough to stand out in a crowded genre. Another thing that I've noticed is just how addictive the gameplay loop can be, but there's a catch, and a really big one. It really only clicks after you get past the initial confusion. But more on that later. Anyway, once you start to understand how all the systems in Graveyard Keeper connect, crafting, farming, managing corpses, upgrading your graveyard, and eventually automating tasks with zombies, the game can transform into this cycle of constant progression. You're always working towards something, whether it's unlocking a new tech, optimizing your workflow, or squeezing more efficiency out of your daily routine. And that's where things lift off. What might initially feel clunky and overwhelming slowly turns into a rhythm, where every small improvement feeds into the next, making your time investment feel worthwhile. Once you reach that point, it becomes very hard to put the game down, with hours just disappearing because there's always one more thing to do. And that sense of gradual mastery is what makes the experience so rewarding. However, the game can get extremely grind-heavy, to the point where it starts feeling less like meaningful progression and more like pure busywork. In Graveyard Keeper, even the simplest tasks are rarely simple. They're broken down into multiple layers of crafting, resource gathering, and processing steps that force you to constantly move back and forth between locations. You want to complete an objective? Well, be prepared to first gather materials and refine them, then craft immediate components, and only then get what you actually need. That constant chaining of tasks creates a loop that can feel repetitive and unnecessarily time-consuming, especially in the early and mid-game. I could describe it as arcane busywork, not because the systems are inherently bad, but because they are stretched out in a way that feels like padding rather than depth. Over time, this can wear you down, turning what could have been a satisfying management experience into something that feels more like a chore than a game. In Graveyard Keeper, you're not just doing one thing over and over again. You're constantly bouncing between farming, alchemy, dungeon crawling, trading, managing the church, and progressing through a surprisingly deep tech tree. At first, it can feel like a lot, but over time, you can kinda figure out how interconnected everything is, how resources from one activity feed into another, and how each system supports your overall progression. That variety creates a sense that there's always something meaningful to work towards, whether it's unlocking a new crafting tier, improving your graveyard rating, or pushing further into the dungeon. All these elements feel well thought out, and that's what gives the game its staying power. Instead of burning out quickly, you're pulled into this ongoing loop of discovery and optimization where progress feels steady and there's always a new goal on the horizon. Problem is, the game explains itself very poorly, especially in the early hours. Graveyard Keeper throws a ton of interconnected systems at you, but gives very little in terms of clear guidance on how they actually work or how you're supposed to progress. As a result, I found myself constantly alt-tabbing to look up stuff on the wiki to understand basic mechanics, things like where to go next, how crafting chains connect, or where certain NPCs are even available. Every fundamental progression paths can feel vague or completely unexplained, which turns what should be discovery into confusion. You practically need extensive web research just to move forward efficiently, and that's where frustration can kick in. Instead of feeling like you're learning the game naturally, it can feel like you're fighting against it, especially in the early game where everything is new and overwhelming. One other aspect that I like is the game's presentation, especially its pixel art and overall atmosphere. Graveyard Keeper uses a detailed, handcrafted pixel style that manages to be both charming and slightly unsettling at the same time, which perfectly matches its dark, morbid theme. The environments, character designs, and even the way animations are handled all contribute to a world that feels alive in its own weird, twisted way. The music and ambient sound design do a lot of heavy lifting as well, reinforcing that eerie but oddly cozy vibe the game is going for. It creates this strange contrast where you're dealing with grim subject matter, but the presentation makes it feel almost relaxing. Overall, the art style, direction, and atmosphere are genuinely strong, and they play a huge role in making the experience memorable. Now, one thing I need to say is that the lack of pressure in the game is actually a huge plus, because it creates a more relaxed, sandbox-like experience where you're free to explore and optimize without feeling rushed. It gives the game a sense of openness that stands in contrast to more structured sims. And for the right type of player, that freedom makes the whole experience feel more personal and rewarding. That would be all nice and fine if the pacing doesn't make it stumble, and it ties directly into how progression is handled. You see, in Graveyard Keeper, progress can feel both slow and uneven, especially in the early stages. You spend a significant amount of time doing repetitive, low-reward tasks before the more interesting systems even start to open up. And that's the core issue. Many of the features that actually make the game fun, like automation or more advanced crafting options, are locked behind hours of setup. You can pretty much play the game for around 40 hours and it can be genuinely enjoyable overall, but a good chunk of these, especially the first 10 hours, feel like filler you have to push through. That early grind ends up being the biggest barrier because instead of gradually easing you into the game's depth, it front-loads frustration and delays the payoff, which can turn a lot of people away before the game really gets going. Resource management is another area where the game starts to wear you down, mainly because it feels more tedious than it needs to be. In Graveyard Keeper, inventory space is limited, storage is spread out, and you're constantly running back and forth between different stations just to complete a single task. On top of that, crafting chains can get overly complicated, where even basic items require multiple layers of submaterials, each within their own processing steps. Instead of feeling like meaningful depth, it often comes across as unnecessary friction, like the game is stretching out simple actions just to slow you down. That constant micromanagement, combined with all the travel and setup required, can make the experience feel more like juggling logistics than actually progressing, and for a lot of people, that crosses the line from engaging into outright frustration. NPC and quest design is another area where things aren't great, mostly because the game places a lot of restrictions on when and how you can interact with characters. NPCs follow very rigid schedules, often appearing only on specific days or at certain times, and the game doesn't always communicate this clearly. That means you can easily miss an interaction and end up waiting an entire in-game week just to try again. On top of that, key actions like selling items or progressing certain quests are tied to specific NPCs, so if they are not available, your progress is effectively halted. Instead of adding realism, this system often feels like an artificial barrier that slows everyone down, making you feel like you are stuck waiting rather than actively playing. And over time, that lack of flexibility can turn routine interactions into frustrating roadblocks. So now that everything has been said and done, how would I summarize this situation? This is a game with a fantastic, unique idea and a surprisingly deep set of systems that can become increasingly engaging, but only if you're willing to push through a rough start and a lot of friction along the way. At its best, it's a dark, addictive management sim where everything connects in a satisfying way, giving you that constant sense of progression and optimization. However, at its worst, it can feel like a grind-heavy, poorly explained experience that wastes your time with unnecessary complexity and slow pacing. So my overall takeaway is pretty simple. Graveyard Keeper is a game of extremes. If the systems click with you, you can easily lose dozens of hours to it and genuinely enjoy the process. If they don't, the combination of grind, confusion, and pacing issues will probably push you away before it ever gets good. And I noticed that myself as more time passed, or rather as more I was interacting with the game, and I just wanted it to get over with because I just felt so frustrated and drained, and essentially that's not something you want from a cozy game. Which brings us to the next point, which is, will the sequel fix these issues, or will we just have a new setting, some new features, while the rest remains the same? I don't really have the answer to that question. I just hope the issues that I have outlined here were recognized by the devs long ago, and that the next experience will feel more enjoyable and less frustrating. Because if I encounter the same problems in the sequel, I'm definitely not gonna play this because it's just not worth my time. And not to mention, it frustrates the living shit out of me, so there's that as well. But at the end of the day, that's just my take. Let me know in the comments what you want to see in the sequel, and do you think issues that I have mentioned will be fixed? And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. That's it from me, until the next one.